my name is Luci Pangrazio and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Deakin University in the Centre for Research for Educational Impact. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak at this webinar and thank the many organisers of this conference. Really, there couldn't be a more pressing issue than post-truth and critical digital literacies in these COVID times. So I'd like to begin with a bit of background on my research as a way of framing this talk. Now, my research focuses on digital literacies and the changing nature of digital texts. In particular, my work focuses on how we can develop understandings of the infrastructure or the back end of digital platforms. So just as we might read and deconstruct a book or an article, we can do the same with social media. In this talk, I want to argue that understanding the structure of digital platforms is key to developing critical digital literacies in the post-truth era. But first, I wanted to start with a bit of a story. This is the city of Velez in the Republic of Macedonia, with a population of about 43,000. Now, the 19th century wooden houses that line the steep streets of this village are a reminder of a time when the city was at its peak, forming part of the trade route that connected the Balkan Peninsula and the Aegean Sea via the river. Velez used to make porcelain for much of Yugoslavia, but now it makes fake news. Toward the end of the 2016 US election campaign, Velez hosted over 100 US politics websites. The scale is almost industrial. And now it is gearing up for the 2020 US election. And it's the young, digitally savvy people of Velez that are reaping the rewards. Now, while most news websites that are based in Velez are pro-Trump, the teenagers responsible for them are reported as caring very little about US politics or even the outcome of the 2020 election. Their goal is to create controversial content that can be shared virally across social media platforms. Then they make money through advertising that is embedded alongside these news articles. While the average wage in the city is approximately 4,200 euros a year, some teenagers are earning up to 20 times that through their Google AdSense accounts. So in this presentation, I will focus on addressing this key issue. What critical digital literacies are required in the post-truth era? Now, in many ways, the teenagers of Velez are exemplars par excellence of what it means to be digitally literate. They understand the infrastructure of social media, they know their audience, and they know how to shape the content to suit the medium. Of course, it is their intentions and the lack of perhaps other opportunities to make money in Velez that mean these literacies do not have an entirely positive outcome. So I have three sub-questions. First of all, what is the post-truth era? Second, how do digital platforms compound the effects of the post-truth era? What kinds of literacies are required to critically navigate digital platforms? And I want to conclude the talk today with suggestions toward a research agenda that may help kind of start to tease apart these questions. So what is the post-truth era and what has it got to do with Velez, fake news and digital platforms? Now, over recent years, the term post-truth has been a much talked about phrase, yet it is not well defined. The post-truth era or post-truth politics is a disappearance of this kind of shared objective standards for truth or facts. Facts and truth are instead buried by appeals to emotion and personal belief. But post-truth isn't just the opposite of truth, it's far more complex than that. It involves a range of things: outright lies, willful exaggeration, colourful language, and just generally communication that displaces fact because there is this presumption that it is acceptable to the target audience. Now, although there are many factors that contribute to creating a post-truth era, such as populist politics and changes in social and economic structures, digital platforms certainly contribute. Digital platforms, particularly social media platforms, personalise digital content to a user's history, according to a user's history of clicks and searches. Now, based on this personal data that's generated, algorithms have an uncanny ability to place the right content in your newsfeed at exactly the right time. So the overarching goal is to keep users on the website for as long as possible. In some ways, this isn't a problem in and of itself. However, it is problematic that many people think of digital platforms, particularly social media platforms, as neutral conduits of news and information. So once particular alliances and patterns of interaction are established between users on the platform, algorithms that personalise digital content can lead to what's called filter bubbles that limit the platform's potential as a democratic public sphere in the Habermasian sense, leading to a kind of us and them narrative, or narratives that have potential to erode social cohesion. So in many respects, digital platforms have a kind of agency that must be considered when we're thinking about literacies in the digital age. They're not just neutrally sharing content. In particular, once alliance and patterns of interactions between friends and sources of information are established, algorithms that personalise this content can lead to an overwhelming kind of sense of an echo chamber or a filter bubble. Now, digital platforms have become an unseen modulator of socialities, and in particular, we can think about these as brokering a number of important features, including the construction and representation of digital identities, social relationships and communication with others, the way we seek and interpret news and information, and the perception of different social, religious, racial, and community groups. So what is it about digital platforms that make them so influential on our everyday socialities? There are a few features of digital platforms which have significance when thinking about the post-truth era, and perhaps for our purposes, digital literacies and digital literacies education. So today I will identify and briefly explain 5 of these features. First, platforms produce and rely upon network effects. The theory of network effects comes from economics and claims that the value of a platform depends on the number of users it has. So in the context of digital platforms, the more users a platform has, the more valuable it becomes as a communication service to its members. So Facebook, for example, has become the kind of default social networking service in many parts of the world because the sheer number of users mean that it is the most logical place for individuals to connect with friends online. However, institutions, companies, and other community groups are also drawn to using the platform because it connects them to the public in many useful ways. But as participation increases, so too does the amount of data being generated, which improves the reliability of the information on that platform and the capability of those algorithms to suggest, recommend, and match information to all parties. In many respects, network effects has contributed to the monopolisation of the internet by a few digital platforms, the so-called GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple network. Second, platforms work as a framing device. When a news article or any digital content is shared on social media, it is done so via some kind of social connection, be it a strong or weak tie, or even with the promise of connecting or coercing another person. In this way, digital content is also a conduit for affective relations. Now, this nexus can be particularly problematic when we are thinking about online news or opinion. For example, it is significant that the article was recommended to you by a friend or someone you have a relationship, as they perceive that it will bring you enjoyment or insight into a topic they believe you are interested in. In this sense, it abates one's critical faculties and positions the receiver to be more positively engaged with the content and perhaps to turn off their critical faculties. As these platforms are free, their economic model relies upon data extraction and monetization, and there is a growing awareness of this kind of digital economy that sits in the background. But this is data extraction and monetization, not only by platform operators, but also because platforms are technically open to manipulation by end users. So other third parties, including organizations, corporations, and individuals, can extract and monetize the personal data that is generated through the platform. Platform architecture facilitates frictionless sharing of digital content. So in 2011, Facebook introduced an external like button, a plugin that can be included on any website. So with the advent of this social button, all pages on the web became potentially likable. As Gerlitz and Helmond in their 2013 article explain, this means that Facebook and the external web are increasingly interconnected, as the practices in one space can affect another, rendering both more open and relational. Now, obviously, this is not just a feature of Facebook. Most of the other major platforms now colonize the web through these social buttons. This culture of sharing, liking, and commenting creates an atmosphere in which digital content and digital text can be shared rapidly and widely. Now, while social buttons are often used to share content, it is relational work that it performs which is most significant. Finally, to manage the extreme amount of information users can potentially encounter through the internet, many digital platforms aim for increased levels of personalisation. Google, for example, provides personalised results for search queries based on browsing histories and social connections. On social media platforms such as Facebook, information is not only filtered through the user's curated social networks, but also interface design and the newsfeed algorithm. Of course, this makes things in the digital context easier for the user to navigate because there is a wealth of information out there. It's overwhelming, but it also leads to what has been called echo chambers or a kind of groupthink. Now, there have been recent kinds of critical explorations of these terms like filter bubbles and the extent to which they actually exist. And I'm thinking here of the work of Axel Bruns. But I think it is paradoxical in many ways that in the information age, we are actually becoming exposed to less diverse range of news and opinion. The extent to which that has an effect, I guess, is still really being worked out, and there's not a overriding sense of filter bubbles having a profound effect or not. But clearly, news is tailored to the individual in some way. So how can we develop critical digital literacies? The features of digital platforms identified highlight some of the literacies required to understand the technical, political, and social layers implicit in the creation and dissemination of information in the post-truth era. Now, in the context of social media, one needs an intertextual, effective, and networked reading of the content in question. But first, digital literacy educators need to acknowledge that it is not just the content on digital platforms that is significant, but the platform itself, which needs to be approached as an object of study. So today I have 5 suggestions for how we can begin to first research and then understand the best way to support the development of critical digital literacies in the post-truth era. Now, the first of these is pretty straightforward, and it is to identify just how news reading practices are changing. Encountering news articles socially, say through social media, rather than the sphere of news and information, means that articles are not necessarily read in context, giving people less opportunity to compare structure, style, and voice to other news articles. Related to this is discovering that news and information is no longer an individual pursuit, but instead part of this larger kind of social endeavour, which is indelibly connected to identity practices. This not only changes how people find out about news and information, but also their fundamental disposition towards engaging with them. Typically, Users do not feel the need to be critical in this space, as social media platforms like Facebook are a site for communication, sharing, enjoyment, interaction, and news and information have become part of that. Also required is an understanding of the platform architecture, including its structure and function, as well as the algorithms and processes that govern relationships, allowing the various components to interoperate. Now, while this might seem an obvious point, many people fail to intuit the fact that the architecture of the platform is designed to encourage participation from users that will benefit the platform. The production of an individual with agency and critical capacity is not necessarily their ambition. So introducing a more critical disposition toward the presentation of information at the interface is an important first step toward developing critical digital literacies. Analysing Facebook's newsfeed algorithm or Google's PageRank algorithm would help young people to think about what is not prioritised or even shown on the interface, which is a powerful way to critique the motivations of platform operators. You could think about the design, the way things are presented to the user. Being aware of these specific issues is useful to understanding the way in which fake news articles are presented and circulated across the platform. For example, with regard to the post-truth era, it might be helpful to think about the function of the like button and the role that is played in opening connections between social media platforms and the wider web. Being more conscious and aware of its function on the platform would also be a useful step toward more conscious and thoughtful sharing. Now, it's also important to build an understanding of how digital platforms fit into a broader network of technological and semantic systems. This calls for a basic knowledge about how networks can be used as a tool for discovery and decision-making, including an understanding of the potential benefits and pitfalls of these networks. Importantly, even the same feature of a platform can be seen in different ways depending on the situation. For example, in the case of a natural disaster, network effects are obviously advantageous because alerts and warnings can be quickly shared across populations. However, in the case of misinformation, the same feature of networks is problematic. So visualising and mapping the networks that underlie these digital platforms could be quite helpful, with a particular focus on understanding who benefits from particular connections and who perhaps is disadvantaged. Identifying and exploring the blind spots within the networks would also help individuals to critically evaluate structures and functions that are typically beyond perspicuity. Critical digital literacies encourage young people to analyse the ideologies implicit to a text. However, it is not just the ideology of the text that requires scrutiny, but the digital platforms that disseminate this content. Now, these require sophisticated digital literacies due to the opacity of the architecture behind the digital platforms, as I've spoken about. Now, one way to develop literacies could be through an understanding of the political economy. While this might sound difficult, it could be started by something as simple as unpacking the role of metrics on a platform and understanding the connection between metrics and commodification. Finally, individuals should be encouraged to think about how sharing news and information relates to their socialities through affect. Affect can be thought of as the more subliminal forces that drive behaviours, but which defy categorisation into typical emotions such as happiness and sadness. Economic historian Philip Morosky, for example, argues that the interface is a continuously destabilising identity, distilling an individual's identity into a jumble of unexplained tastes and alliances in such a way that requires this kind of ongoing care and management. Now, this creates a kind of perpetual lack, which can only be quelled through visiting and maintaining that platformed identity. So cultivating an awareness in users about how affect condenses and intensifies through metrics and notifications might help create a critical distance from the platform that is necessary to evaluate fake news articles. So given the features of digital platforms and their role in disseminating news and information that I've outlined today, there is clearly a need for future research in this area. However, with recent initiatives being directed toward fact-checking tools and platform-based governance, often in the form of checklists and flags, there is the potential that research and education developing social and political understandings of digital platforms in individuals will be deprioritised. So in this talk, I've tried to outline the specific digital literacies required to help individuals to be responsive to the changing nature of news and information in the post-truth era. Now, this is not to replace literacies that will critically engage with the content that is presented, but to draw attention to the infrastructure that enables the creation and dissemination of this misinformation in the first place. So from this perspective, the following questions point to some areas that require further in-depth research and investigation. The first of these might be, how do digital platforms reconfigure news and information gathering practices? And what kinds of state-based regulations might be appropriate? We have a very interesting case in Australia at the moment taking place between the ACCC and Facebook and Google as well, and the presentation of news on those platforms. Second, what critical understandings do people already have of digital platforms and their role in disseminating news and information? And in what ways are these applied in daily digital practices? It's really important that we start from a realistic basis. We can't expect people to change radically their everyday practices, but perhaps incrementally. So what would work in with what people are already doing? What critical practices and techniques have been successfully applied to news and information in the past? And can these be applied to digital platforms? Again, having a look at those kind of critical practices is a very helpful way forward. Although the medium is different, there might be some ways they can be transformed to suit a digital context. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, what are the short and long-term consequences for society and democracy as news and information are increasingly disseminated through social networks? So thanks for listening today. I'd be more than happy to take up any questions or suggestions on this research agenda in the roundtable discussion. Thank you.